Okay, so have you ever felt like you're really putting in the time studying, but nothing's really sticking?
Yeah.
Or maybe the motivation's just gone AWOL and
Yeah.
you're best friends with procrastination now.
hmm
Yeah, well, if any of that sounds familiar, stick around because in this deep dive, we're going to explore 6 pretty unusual study methods
Right.
that are actually backed by science.
Yeah. And these go way beyond the usual tips and tricks you might have heard before.
Yeah, so we're really aiming to help you, like, totally transform your learning experience.
Yeah. Totally.
Sharpen your focus, boost your memory power, and maybe even start to enjoy studying a bit more.
Exactly. It's about working smarter, not harder.
Yeah, for sure. So let's jump right in with the first one. It's called the brain fooling method. And I'm not going to lie, the name kind of makes me chuckle,
Yeah, it's a catchy one.
right? So the research we found basically points to this resistance that we often feel when we try to force ourselves to study.
Oh, absolutely. It's like our brains just slam on the brakes.
Yeah, exactly. Like, nope, not doing that.
Because it knows studying might be a bit of a slog. It anticipates that potential discomfort.
Yeah, and our brains are wired to like chase those good feelings and avoid anything that feels like a chore.
It's totally natural to kind of shy away from things that we perceive as difficult or boring.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. They talk about this thing called the 5-minute rule,
Oh, yeah, I love this one.
right? So you basically just tell yourself, okay, I'm only going to study for 5 minutes.
It sounds almost too simple, right?
I know, right? Like, would that even work?
But that's kind of the beauty of it. By setting such a tiny goal, you're kind of tricking your brain.
Yeah, you're lowering the bar so much that it
Hmm.
doesn't even feel like a big deal to get started.
Exactly. There's no reason for your brain to resist because it's just 5 minutes. What's the harm in that?
And then what happens? Like, what's the next part of this trick?
Well, once you actually get going, something interesting tends to happen. You start engaging with the material, maybe you find something that piques your interest, and suddenly those 5 minutes turn into 10, then 20, maybe even a whole hour.
Right, it's like you've outsmarted your own brain.
In a way, yeah, it's like a
Yeah.
little mental judo move.
So this actually ties into something called the Zeigarnik effect,
Mhm.
which is basically our brain's natural tendency to want to finish what we start.
Yeah, we hate having loose ends. So that little 5 minute promise is like the initial spark, and then your brain's desire for completion kind of kicks in and keeps you going.
Okay, so if you're listening to this right now and you're staring at your textbook, feeling that procrastination monster creeping up on you,
I know that feeling all too well.
just try this 5-minute rule.
Yeah.
Seriously, what have you got to lose?
Exactly. It's all about lowering that initial hurdle.
Yeah, just get started and see what happens. Okay, let's move on to technique number 2. This one's called the immersion technique.
Ooh, I like this one too.
This one kind of shifts the focus away from those like super structured study sessions,
Mm.
and it embraces this idea that learning can be a much more constant, ongoing process,
It's not just about being chained to your desk for hours on end.
right? It's about finding ways to integrate learning into your daily life.
And the cool thing is you can get really creative with this.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The research gives some really practical examples, like changing the language settings on your phone to the language you're learning.
I've actually tried that one. It's surprisingly effective, even if you only pick up a few words here and there.
Yeah, it's like these little mini lessons throughout the day.
Right, and it doesn't feel like studying at all.
Okay, what about listening to podcasts or audiobooks while you're working out or walking the dog?
Oh, that's a great one. I do that all the time. It's like multitasking for your brain.
Yeah, and even just watching movies or YouTube videos related to the subject you're studying can make a difference.
Absolutely. It all contributes to that sense of immersion. You're surrounding yourself with the material.
And what's happening in the brain when we do this? Like, how does this actually help us learn?
Well, every time you encounter the language, the concepts, the information, it reinforces those neural pathways in your brain. It's like strengthening those connections.
And it's happening passively, right?
Right.
Like you're not necessarily trying to actively memorize anything.
Exactly. It's like osmosis. You're absorbing the information just by being exposed to it.
So the key takeaway here is to think about how you can weave learning into your daily routine.
Right. Make it a part of your life, not just a chore. You have to check off your to-do list.
Okay, so on to technique number 3. This one is called the gamification trick,
Oh, this is a fun one.
right? So think about how addictive video games can be,
Oh, yeah. I've lost many hours to those.
right? And the research actually makes this connection between that level of engagement that we get from games and the struggle we often have with studying.
It's a brilliant insight because video games are masters at tacking into our brain's reward system.
Yeah, there's always something to achieve points, to earn levels, to unlock.
And every time we hit those milestones, our brain releases dopamine, which makes us feel good and motivates us to keep playing.
So the idea is to hack that same system and apply it to studying.
Exactly. Turn studying into a game.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we gamify studying?
Well, there are a bunch of ways you can do this. You could set up a points and reward system for yourself.
Okay, so like if I finish this chapter, I get to watch an episode of my favorite show.
Exactly. Or if I study for an hour, I get to treat myself to a coffee.
Yeah, and the research also mentions using apps like Anki or Quizlet.
Oh yeah, those are great. They turn flashcards into a game. So it's not just rote memorization anymore.
Yeah, and you can even compete against friends.
Oh, that's a good one. A little friendly rivalry can really boost your motivation.
So the takeaway here is that you can make learning more fun and engaging by borrowing some techniques from the gaming world.
Absolutely. It's about tapping into those natural reward pathways in your brain.
Yeah, make studying feel less like a chore and more like a challenge you actually want to conquer.
It's a great way to reframe your perspective.
All right, on to number 4. This one's called the unconventional environment switch.
Interesting.
So most of us have that one spot where we always go to study.
Yeah, like a designated study zone.
Right. But the research suggests that always studying in the same place might actually be holding us back.
It seems counterintuitive, right?
I know. But it all comes down to this thing called context-dependent memory.
Which basically means that our brains are really good at linking information to the environment where we learned it.
So if you're always studying at your desk in your room, your memory of that information might become too strongly associated with that specific location.
So when you're in a different setting, like taking an exam in a classroom, your brain might have a harder time retrieving that information.
That makes sense. So how do we break free from this context dependency?
Well, the research suggests that studying in different environments can actually improve your recall.
Interesting. So instead of always studying in your room, you could try a coffee shop, a library, a park,
Even just a different room in your house.
or even just switching chairs.
Exactly. The idea is to expose your brain to the material in a variety of contexts.
So it's like creating multiple pathways to that information in your brain.
Exactly. More access points, more ways to retrieve it.
And not only that, but sometimes a change of scenery can just help you focus better, right?
Absolutely. A new environment can be really stimulating, and it can help break up the monotony of always studying in the same place.
So the takeaway here is to experiment with your study environment.
Don't be afraid to mix things up. See if a change of scenery helps you concentrate and remember things better.
Okay, let's dive into technique number 5. This one's called the reverse learning method.
Okay, this sounds intriguing.
So we're all pretty familiar with the traditional way of studying, right?
Yeah.
You read, you take notes, you try to memorize.
The classic approach.
But this method flips that on its head. It suggests that you try teaching the material instead.
So it's like becoming the teacher rather than the student.
Right, and this is where the Feynman technique comes in.
Named after the famous physicist Richard Feynman.
So how does this technique actually work?
Well, the basic premise is that if you can't explain something simply, you probably don't understand it well enough yourself.
Okay, so it's about forcing yourself to really grasp the concepts.
Exactly.
So the first step is to choose a topic you're struggling with.
Right, something that's giving you a hard time.
And then imagine you're explaining it to a 5-year-old.
This is the key part, because it forces you to break down the information into its simplest form.
You can't use any jargon or complicated language. You have to make it understandable to someone with no prior knowledge.
And as you try to do that, you'll quickly realize where your own understanding is lacking.
You'll stumble over things that you thought you knew, but when you have to explain it simply, those gaps in your knowledge become really obvious.
And that's valuable information, because now you know exactly what you need to go back and study more.
So you're basically identifying your weak spots and then targeting those areas.
Exactly. It's a very targeted approach to study.
Yeah. So even if you don't actually have a 5-year-old handy, just the act of preparing to teach someone else is super beneficial.
It forces you to process the information on a much deeper level.
Okay, on to our final technique number 6. This one's called the sound trick that enhances focus.
I'm curious about this one.
So this one might seem counterintuitive because we're often told that silence is best for studying.
Right. Minimize distractions.
But the research suggests that certain types of sound can actually improve concentration and even boost your memory.
Really? Now that's interesting.
So let's break down some of the specific sounds that the research mentions. First up, we have white noise.
Ah, yes, white noise.
Yeah.
It's like a blanket of sound.
Right, and it can be really effective at blocking out those distracting background noises.
Especially if you're in a noisy environment like a coffee shop or a dorm room.
It creates this kind of consistent hum that helps you tune out everything else.
Like a sonic shield for your brain.
Yeah, exactly. Then we have binaural beats.
Those are a bit more trippy.
Yeah, they're created by playing slightly different sound frequencies into each ear.
And your brain perceives this third phantom frequency, which can actually help synchronize your brain waves.
Right, so it's like tuning your brain to a specific frequency that promotes focus and concentration.
It's pretty wild when you think about it.
And lastly, there's instrumental music.
Like lo-fi beats or classical music.
Exactly. The idea here is that it can provide a background rhythm and keep you engaged without the distraction of lyrics.
Yeah, lyrics can sometimes hijack your attention and pull you away from your studies.
So the takeaway here is to experiment with different sounds and see what works best for you.
Don't be afraid to break free from the silence dogma. You might be surprised at how certain sounds can actually enhance your focus and productivity.
So that wraps up our 6 unusual study methods
We've covered a lot of ground.
we have. And it's been fascinating to see how these techniques really leverage the power of our brains.
It's all about working with your brain, not against it.
Exactly. So for you, our listener, we want to leave you with a challenge.
A call to action.
Think about which of these techniques resonates most with you.
Which one speaks to your current study habits or the challenges you're facing?
And how could you see yourself incorporating it into your routine?
Even starting today.
Because even small changes can make a big difference.
And beyond these 6 techniques, what other unconventional approaches might align with your unique learning style?
It's all about finding what works best for you and unlocking your full learning potential.
So go out there, experiment, and see what happens.
You might be surprised at what you discover.
Happy studying.
We'll see you in the next deep dive.